There was no beginning that could be pointed to. Before time learned to divide itself into moments, before it understood before and after, rise and fall, cause and echo, there was only continuity, a vast and unbroken state of being that required no measure and invited no question, not darkness as absence, but darkness as depth, a boundless, patient field in which nothing needed to arrive, because nothing had ever been missing. In that continuity, nothing waited, nothing hurried, nothing feared dissolution, because nothing yet knew the difference between staying and becoming. From this quiet immensity, the world did not burst forth or declare itself. There was no sudden spark, no fracture of silence, no triumph of existence over void. What would one day be called creation did not arrive as an event. It clarified. Reality folded inward upon itself, not in violence, but in grace, and found a condition that would not move, a presence that did not resist, did not yield, did not compete, something that accepted all pressure without changing its nature. The stone was already there. It had never been formed because forming requires sequence, and sequence had not yet learned how to proceed. The stone did not awaken. It did not remember a time before itself because such a time could not exist. Memory requires contrast, and the stone had always been. It did not know duration. It knew weight. Weight was the first truth. Not mass, not burden, not strain, but consequence. The quiet pressure created when being chose to persist rather than dissolve back into the endless flow. The stone did not command this pressure. It did not direct it or impose it. It accepted it fully, and in that acceptance became the point at which the infinite learned restraint. This was creation, not an act of will, but a balance held. Around the stone, the great presence of existence gathered, not as rivals and not as enemies, but as beings that had always moved through one another without need of name or distinction. Motion continued, yet learned to bend. Expansion pressed outward and discovered without resistance that there were limits it did not wish to cross. Unmaking remained possible, but no longer absolute. Even dissolution learned to pause. Nothing was cast away. Nothing was overcome. Each presence remained itself, not through dominance, but through the quiet recognition that persistence required restraint. From this recognition, the world was allowed to take form. What flowed without edge slowed just enough to linger. What would have torn itself apart instead learned to remain beside what was different. No hand shaped this balance and no will imposed it. The world was not forged, nor assembled, nor claimed. It was permitted by forces that had always existed and had always known that to continue, they must endure together. Where the flow of reality passed through the stone's bearing, It slowed just enough to acquire edges. Shape emerged. Not imposed, but allowed matter learned to linger. The wild current that would later be named magic bent gently around constraint and emerged altered. No longer capable of tearing itself apart without consequence. Land rose where pressure gathered patiently. Depth formed where weight was allowed to rest. Seas pooled where motion found a basin it did not need to flee. Mountains were not monuments. They were held breath. Valleys were not wounds. They were places where the world exhaled. Nothing was designed. Nothing was aligned. The stone did not protect what stood upon it. It made standing possible. Life did not arise through intention, nor was it summoned by design. It appeared where stability endured long enough to be used. Growth followed patience. Roots did not seek nourishment alone. They sought ground that would remain. Leaves did not reach only for light, but for the assurance that what held them would not withdraw without warning. Movement learned its own limits. Creatures moved until movement no longer destroyed them. Until motion became something the world could bear and return. Change did not arrive through planning or foresight, but through listening, through the quiet understanding shared by all living things. Like the unspoken knowledge that sends birds south or urges herds to move before the land fails them. There was no worship in this age, and no fear to demand it. No doctrine stood between life and the world it inhabited. There was only recognition, not spoken, not taught, not examined, but carried. An inherited knowing that its existence was upheld by something patient, and that to live was to move in answer to it. Recognition required no language before names. There was understanding. A direct knowing that did not need to be held, taught, or repeated. Everything that lived sensed, without instruction, that the ground beneath them was not passive. It was bearing something vast, and that bearing was what allowed existence to continue without the constant threat of sudden absence. This understanding was not examined or questioned. It was carried. It lived in the way roots held fast, in the way currents flowed without tearing their banks apart, in the way creatures trusted that each step would be met. The world did not explain itself to those who lived within it. It simply endured, and that endurance was enough. The stone had no name then, for nothing yet desired to name it. It was a certainty felt through bone and root and current. A quiet assurance that weight would be met with patience, that consequence would not be arbitrary, and that persistence had meaning because something remained beneath it. But understanding does not survive unchanged once it is witnessed. Witness emerged slowly, like a new sense learning to focus, a turning inward, a moment when existence first noticed itself noticing. With witness came attention, and with attention came the desire to hold what was known, to carry it forward, to mark it, to share it. With witness came language. At first, language was gentle. Names were not claims, but gesture, sound, shape to point towards something already understood. But even the softest name creates distance, for to name a thing is to place it outside oneself. The stone did not change in this moment, with the way it was witnessed did. Witnessing became understanding, understanding became knowledge, and knowledge demanded explanation. What had once been grasped whole could now only be approached in fragments. Words reached for truths that would not fit inside them, and meaning, once immediate, became something to be carried forward, conveyed, defended, and repeated. And in trying to preserve what had been known, language unknowingly reshaped it. Each retelling smooths what had been rough, sharpened what had been subtle, and filled silence with intention. The effort to clarify replaced the ability to recognize. This is how myths were born, not as falsehoods, and not through deception, but through distance, meaning passed from one understanding to another that did not fully share it. What could not be held was reshaped to fit what could be remembered. Each telling preserved the shape while losing the weight that gave it substance. Over time, certainty increased, even as comprehension thinned, until stories endured that no longer carried what their first beater had meant. As this distance grew, the world filled itself with rules and boundaries that were perceived rather than discovered. Time came to be understood as a straight passage projected forward as though it did not ripple or return, ignoring the deeper waves moving through it unseen. This comprehension was not false. The rules held and their effects were real. Yet they were only shadows, useful, consistent, and incomplete. What was grasped were abstractions shaped by mortality, fragments carved from something vaster, drifting through an eternal cosmos that could not be fully contained by the measures used to survive within it. The transformation did not alter what bore the world. Weight continued to be met, regardless of how it was spoken of or misunderstood. Belief and disbelief passed over it without effect. Reverence added nothing, neglect removed nothing. Those who moved in accordance with what was already held remained supported. And those who acted as though stability were permission encountered accumulation rather than reprisal. Error endured, not because it was allowed, but because nothing intervened to correct it. Creation was never a gift bestowed nor a promise made. It was a condition that could not fail to be held, a balance present before it was recognized, waiting only to be met. The stone did not ask to be understood, nor did it require attention to endure. What it bore would always have been born. Only once it was done could it be realized that it could not have been otherwise. Those who moved in harmony with what was already held found that the world carried them, not gently, not kindly, but faithfully. Those who pressed against it without listening found resistance waiting, not as judgment, but as consequence, revealing what had always been true. And so the world turned. The place of beauty and fracture of meaning, held in meaning misplaced, of truths that endure regardless of how they are told. Above all, world, why nothing stands alone, not because it is bound, but because it is born. This is the way of the world, not because it was declared so, because it has always been.